I think don't just chase rankings, engineer your representations. Stop chasing vanity rankings for broad generic keywords. Shadows don't care about single keywords. They care about entities and authority. So focus instead on building content that feeds the AI accurate, trustworthy, and brand consistent information. Shadows can be shaped, but those who fail to adapt will face a visibility crisis or watch their authority drain into competitors' shadows. I'm Rose Tero, and this is SEO in 2026.
Rose, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
In 2026, your website casts an AI shadow, essentially a distilled version of your content that AI search systems present to users. And it's often this shadow, not your site, that people now meet first. So it might look like a 2-sentence summary, a list of bullet points, or an AI-curated comparison. And it could be on ChatGPT, Perplexity summaries, SGE, or any of the other LLMs or chatbots. But increasingly, this is a user's first engagement with your brand before they ever reach your pages. Sometimes it's the only interaction they have with your brand. And this matters because it changes the unit of competition. So for years, SEOs have thought in terms of positions. I'm rank 1, rank 3, I'm on page 2. But in an AI-driven world, the real battleground is representation. So how is your brand represented when an AI introduces you to the user? Is it accurate? Is it authoritative? Or, and this is happening more and more, are you simply fueling the answer while a competitor gets the credit? So the insight here is that SEO is evolving from being about rankings to being about representation signals. It's not enough to publish content and hope it ranks. You need to actively manage how your content is summarized, how your expertise is attributed, and how your brand shows up in that new AI shadow layer.
Me and my shadow. So how do you find out what's in your shadow and what do you do about it?
Something you can do is to pick 25 to 50 topics and branded questions that are applicable to your company, your industry. Check how you appear in Google AI overviews, ChatGPT, SearchGPT, Perplexity, and Claude. Log whether you're cited, log how you're summarized, and log which competitors are credited. And also check for any errors or gaps, such as factual errors or places where there's shadow leakage. So there's your information but being credited to a competitor. And then you can begin to map each gap to a fix, such as adding more schema, increasing your off-site corroboration, or adding quotable snippets on your key pages.
Beware shadow leakage. I like that one. So how can you determine if some of the content that you've perhaps published in the past is attributed to a competitor, and what can you actually do about it to change it?
So you can do this while doing your shadow audit. You can see if, for example, if you run a hotel, if any of your page info is being credited, is being listed what you offer, but being credited to a competitor. I think the key ways to kind of combat this is to create highly original content, such as benchmarks, original studies, things like that, that AI has to credit you with. It's very much about integrating your brand and your USP in your content so that your content becomes an extension of your brand, and so that it isn't something generic that could be easily copied across other companies.
Okay, you say the signals that shape shadows, structured data eat, entity consistency, content clarity. How do you decide what needs to be focused on first in order to optimize what's in your shadow?
It has to be a combination of things. This is where it gets practical. So if you want to optimize your AI shadow, you need to think beyond the rankings and start engineering for summarization. So for example, write shadow-ready content. So AIs love clarity. They need unambiguous structures that they can turn into neat answers. So that means building FAQs or answer capsules into your pages. These are short 2 to 3 sentence summaries right at the top that directly address the query, add the answers in plain language, break processes into steps or lists. Essentially, AIs are lazy, so you need to feed it the cleanest possible material to reuse. Next, you need to strengthen your machine-readable trust. So schema markup is essential. It helps AIs to disambiguate your content and understand context. If you're a hotel, for example, that means marking up reviews, pricing, and amenities. If you're a publisher, use article and author schema. If you're SaaS, product schema. Structured data doesn't just win you rich results, it also makes your shadow more accurate and more likely to carry your name. Another step would be to double down on EAT, like you mentioned. So generative systems are highly sensitive to authority cues. Make sure your authorship is clear and credible. Build consistent signals of expertise across third-party sites. So push reviews, citations, mentions, because the shadow doesn't just reflect what's on your site, it reflects the broader perception of your brand. And that's really important. I think also engineer attribution opportunity. So this is where most people miss the trick. If your content is fueling answers, but you're not credited, you've got that shadow leakage. So to plug it, you need to publish unique assets, like I mentioned, that AI can't paraphrase without citing you. And then I suppose the final step would just be to inspect and iterate. So just as SEOs used to check SERPs, now we need to check shadows. Search your priority queries in Google AI mode, Perplexity, etc. Look at how you're represented and see if you're present. Are you credited? Is the description accurate? That's your shadow audit. Fix the gaps, then keep rechecking.
I like your phrase machine readable trust as well. You also talk about publishing unique assets. So what would be an example of a unique asset that a brand could publish?
So for example, a proprietary survey. So collect your own data, turn it into a study that can only be attributed to you. Original data, use some of your own case studies or your own users' generated content. Things that are tied to you and unique to you.
Okay, got you. And is there any style of content, length of content, content type that is more likely to be picked up by AI and used by AI because it understands that you're the only brand that has produced that?
I think it goes back to framing the content in a way that is easy for AI to scan. So nothing too wordy or poetic. For example, headings with simple questions, simple answers. Things like tables, comparison data is very useful, especially as we begin to move into the next stage of search, which is maybe agentic browsing, which is when we'll be sending bots out to get the information for us. We need our information to be clearly understandable by a machine, more so now than ever before. And a good side effect of that is if it's clear for a machine to read, it will also be clear and obvious for a user. So it's not a choice between one or the other.
So by making it clear for a machine, you're essentially saying make sure that it's marked up as effectively as possible, but also I would assume that you're talking about changing the structure of your content so that you've perhaps got an explanatory summary of what your piece is about at the beginning and perhaps more chunks within your content to appeal to machines. And if that is indeed your recommendation, then does that not make it obvious to readers that your content's built for machines and perhaps a little less relevant for them?
I wouldn't say so. I think the things that machines look for, which is something like an answer capsule at the spot that kind of at the top that summarizes what's in the article, is actually very on brand with what users are looking for in an age where everything is delivered quickly. Our attention spans are less. We don't necessarily want to read a narrative essay about what a product offers. We want to get to the point, and that's very much what Google also wants to do. So I do think they're kind of hand in hand in that way.
Okay, they go hand in hand. So you don't necessarily have to design for one over the other. And one other thing that you mentioned is building a reputation beyond the site is key. So are you actually publishing content with a view to it being published and consumed on a platform like ChatGPT?
I think it's important to have an eye for that. I don't think necessarily that's the only place. It should be multimodal content. So it should be content that's suitable across the internet, because it used to all be about Google search, and now it's all attention is spread across all these different LLMs like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, all these things. So not just one place.
Not just one place, okay. And how many places is too many? Is it possible just to publish or try to publish in as many different places as possible, or should you narrow it down to a certain number of places that you know that your audience is more likely to interact in?
I think it depends very much on your industry. So, for example, I work in the hotel SEO industry. So third-party corroboration is especially valuable from, for example, review sites, OTAs, perhaps community pages, places like this. But it depends on the area you work in. You need to have an understanding of your users' persona, where they go. Are they more on social? Like, have a vague idea of their user journey, and then try to meet them at those separate digital touch points as much as possible.
And something else you say is that the future of SEO in the age of shadows is about the shift from ranking signals to representation signals. What are representation signals?
So representation signals essentially are the cues that AI systems use to decide how to introduce you. So these might be things like facts, citations, author, entity credibility, recency, and corroboration across the web. Classic ranking factors decide where a page appears, but representation signals decide what the AI says about you and whether you get named and linked at all. So there is a subtle difference.
And how do you measure representation signals?
I think that comes from the AI audit and kind of having a look through priority prompts to see how you are represented in the LLMs. So asking key questions, typing these in and seeing if your name comes up. And if it does, then how it's being described, how it's being explained. And from there, seeing gaps that you ought to be filling or brand understanding that is missing, things like that.
You said that this comes from the AI audit. What is an AI audit and how do you conduct one? What software do you use and how often do you have to do one?
So I think the tools aren't quite there yet. There isn't a perfect tool yet for doing an AI audit, but I think that's being worked on. I think the most thorough way at the minute is to do a manual one, which is to pick your top prompts for your client, for your industry, and search them yourself. I think don't just choose one LLM, choose a couple to see how you're appearing across different places. You could do this semi-regularly, perhaps every month or so, just to get an idea of how you're coming across to LLM users, etc., and then plugging those gaps.
Okay, and plugging those gaps. What does plugging those gaps mean? Simply creating content in a more machine-readable, friendly manner.
So it could depend what the gaps is. It could be if AI is struggling to understand what's in your content, that could mean using more specific schema. It could be improving your third-party corroboration. So if there are gaps in entity optimization, you need to make sure there's consistent information on your brand across lots of different places, and that is, fixed within the content. You need to have a really strong about page. You need to have a really strong brand fact area that gives all the important data on your company. It could be address, USP, things like that. And you need to make that super, super clear to AI, who you are, what you're about. And if there isn't that clarity, you'll be able to see quite clearly as you do these searches and kind of look at how you're represented in that shadow layer.
Rose, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
I think don't just chase rankings, engineer your representations. Stop chasing vanity rankings for broad generic keywords. Shadows don't care about single keywords. They care about entities and authority. So focus instead on building content that feeds the AI accurate, trustworthy, and brand consistent information. Shadows can be shaped, but those who fail to adapt will face a visibility crisis or watch their authority drain into competitors' shadows.
Rose Tero is a senior SEO strategist at Formula. Find out more over at thisisformula.com. Rose, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thank you.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.